Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Since we have a fantastic panel lined up here with six speakers plus myself. So this morning when I bumped into our organizer, the beautiful lady out there, she was saying, Anga, you have six panelists, we have no chair. I said, just bring a special chair for me. So now you can see the interesting chair I have. But more than that, let's have a conversation around corruption and anti-corruption measurement in this panel. It's not a presentation, it's more like an informal or whatever we call it, chat, based on the experiences and also insights from the distinguished panelists. And of course, I would also like to request whoever wants to jump into providing inputs. But please don't spend 15 minutes in your comments. Try to be also productive in terms of your inputs as well. So this is all about panel. My job is more of a timekeeper today than even speaking myself. But let me also give you like a few of our, a few things which can set the stage for discussion. First of all, during last 2 decades, we spend a lot of time developing methodologies, defining terminologies from illicit financial flows to financial integrity to corruption itself, whether it's perception or whether it's experience and so on, and also indicators on public let's say, integrity in government indicators, or some other open government partnership, what we mean by that, EITI, and so on. There has been a lot of transparency movements that are also helping the methodology data and so on. So now the discussion is not just about, oh, corruption is very difficult to measure, but it's more about can we reliably, consistently, have some measures that make sense in terms of policy reform and so on. The second thing is that the data and technologies, we heard in this conference, big data analytics could be also a game changer in terms of, corruption and anti-corruption measurement and so on. But again, looking into reality on the ground, we are not quite there. We had this SDG 16 progress report last year, which we published our UN agencies, and only few countries are reporting on illicit financial flows, on the experience of bribery and corruption and so on. But we are not quite there. We have tools. We do have new methodology develops, but it still is it very challenging. And on anti-corruption, especially, we are still relying on compliance. Can we have better measures in terms of moving from compliance to effectiveness? So that's also the big issue out there. So without further ado, so we have fantastic panel here. I'm only going to mention their first name and what they do rather than going through their long bios, and you can Google them. They are all famous people in their respective field. On my right, we have Elizabeth David Barrett. She's Professor of Governance and Integrity and Director of Center for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. And she was also leading the global initiative on measuring corruption in her previous incarnation. And by the way, I inherited that initiative from her. And then on my left, I have Tom Cardamon, the President and CEO of Global Financial Integrity. And we have Raymond, also the founding president sitting there. And Drago Kos, where is Drago is here. He has many hats. One of them is the chair of OECD Working Group on bribery. Not anymore, yeah? Yeah. Then Carolis, good to have you here from the Open Government Partnership, and then Jasper Johnson, the deputy head of the Division on Anti-Corruption and Integrity from OECD, and of course Roberto, and he's the head of division at TI on. Research coordinator on corruption measurement tools at TI. So anything about barometer or perception index, you can ask him any question. So yeah, let me just directly go to Liz. You have experience, this collecting data and also case studies in Italy, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa on measuring corruption. What are the main challenges in collecting reliable data, as well as indexing them, based on your experience?
Thanks very much, Anga. Yeah, it's working. So just a few reflections on the 18 months that I spent heading up that global program on measuring corruption at the International Anti-Corruption Academy. If you're interested in more of the findings, we have 8 insights briefs that are on the IACA website. But a few sort of summarized thoughts from that. The first is that while there are many measures now, absolute proliferation of measures of corruption and related aspects of governance, overall, we're still tremendously reliant on subjective data. There are good reasons for that. Corruption is very difficult to observe. So we often sort of rely on surveys and on expert perceptions, but at the same time, we know that there are lots of flaws and limitations of that. That kind of data is subject to bias. It's influenced by factors like media coverage of scandals. It's influenced by partisan preferences. It's even influenced by how much a country is doing on anti-corruption itself. So one reflection is that we're still very reliant on this data, which is quite flawed. Secondly, with any global index, there's a real trade-off between standardization and contextualization. And I say this because in our policy work as practitioners, we're often finding and often saying, look, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to combating corruption. But then if you want to have a global index, you are implicitly suggesting that there is a one-size-fits-all because you're looking for certain indicators and you're comparing them across countries. So that is out of line with much of what we're doing in anti-corruption policy and practice. It also means that we end up with a very simplistic measure, one country, one number. And that's problematic when we know how many decisions are influenced by these corruption indices. And another aspect of that is that actually those indices are not very good at incorporating the latest innovation in corruption measurement. And there's an awful lot of innovation happening at the country level in terms of developing new kinds of indicators. They don't tend to get incorporated very quickly into many of the global indices. Another thing is that those kinds of measures are not very good at measuring change over time. And that's really important. And from our work with countries, we found that they really need that, actually. So a lot of people, whether they're working in governments and anti-corruption agencies or in civil society, they're interested in monitoring change over time. So we really need to get better at doing that. One aspect of that is that there's a trade-off between consistency over time and the need to adapt as corruption patterns and policies evolve. So again, there's a difficulty here between trying to have something that is quite standardized that you can compare over a long time and something that is adapting to how the practice of corruption is changing. So we see some indices that change their methodologies to keep up with practices and also with the innovations in measurement, and some that are really going for the comparability over time. Another challenge is the tension between interoperability of data and privacy of data. So when we're trying to collect data to measure corruption, we talk often about the fact that we need to match up data sets. We need this to be shared among different agencies within government. But that's running into a challenge with increasing concerns around data privacy too, which sometimes can impinge upon the sharing of data or the publishing of data. Sometimes we've got one part of government is charging another part of government for data. So crazy inefficiencies in the system. And finally, then, another challenge is about sustainability of data collection. So whatever we're collecting, we need to make sure that we can continue to collect that over time. And that can also be a real challenge. So for example, if we think about surveys, surveys are extremely expensive to do. So we probably don't want to do them too often. But we need to, if we're going to start putting that in place, we need to think about whether this is something that we can continue to collect over time to really make that kind of data useful. So just a few reflections there on some of our findings.
Oh, thank you, Liz. I think you already, provided a very rich background in terms of challenges, including measuring change over time in order to see the impact of policy reform and then interoperability among all these databases and so on, and also the sustainability and innovation part. Now let's talk about anti-corruption. Not corruption, Drago. And now we have many international norms and standards. The OECD Bribery Convention, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. We also have Greco mechanism. We also have SDG 16 mechanism and reporting. We have Inter-American, African, all these regional convention as well. So far, I feel like we are spending too much time on compliance and checklist and so on. Is there a way to move the whole discussion from compliance to measuring the effectiveness of all these global norms and standards? Is it possible, or is it the big ambition we have? Drago.
Well, first of all, you mentioned, let's say, assessing compliance. That would be an easy exercise. It's not. You mentioned several different monitoring mechanisms which do exist, and let's say, and some of them are really very different than the others. So it's different to make any comparisons already there at the level of compliance, not to talk about the efficiency. So I was chairing the OECD Working Group for Bribery for 9 years, and we are really trying hard to see what are the real impacts of the implementation of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention in the area of enforcement. And you can believe me, it is really, really very hard. It was following the precise statistical data of the number of investigations, prosecutions, adjudications. If the countries were willing to give us the information, then it was not such a big problem. But some countries don't even have the statistics on what they do. So then you cannot ask the countries to invent statistics just because you would like to have statistics yourself. So it depends a lot on the countries what are the sets of the data which they have at their disposal to share with somebody else. But when it comes to the measuring real, let's say, effectiveness of the anti-corruption measures, then of course we are in many problems. Some years ago, there was the attempt by the European Union. European Commission financed a project with the aim to establish rules how to measure and predict consequences of corruption in the area of public procurement. And they brought together really the best possible team then. And I have to say that, well, I will put it that way, the results were not published anywhere. Because really simply we gave up, because we could not do it. So this is really a moving target, and it is moving very, very fast. So before going into any sort of measurement of effectiveness of anti-corruption measures, we will have to reach an agreement. What will we measure? The number of, let's say, cases investigated, prosecuted, sanctioned. Let's say, we will say rely ourselves a bit more on the different research which is conducted, of course not research of perception, but the real research on hard data. We can measure or statistically different things. We will have to first reach agreement on that one. And this is all possible under one condition, that the countries will agree to participate in that. Now, if we try to measure the effectiveness of anti-corruption measures based on the already condensed data which is collected by the international organizations, then I'm afraid that we are lost. First of all, because not all of the countries participate in all monitoring mechanisms. Second, because the monitoring mechanisms are very different by the quality, by the quantity of data collected. So we will have to go down to the countries, and for sure, not all of the countries will be willing to participate in such an exercise. So this is a really, really difficult task. I I don't dare to say yet that it is impossible, but if we manage to convince, maybe not all, but at least majority of countries of the world, that they will offer their data to the, let's say, disposal of those who will do the measurement, then maybe, just maybe, we have a chance.
Oh, thank you, Drago, for being very honest. Of course, you know, the participation and ownership in those processes is equally important, and also the data collection in terms of producing original data. Together with them have more reliability and validity, even to contributing for the policy reform and so on. So now let's talk about measuring integrity in public procurement, Carolis. Can we actually measure integrity in public procurement? What do we mean by integrity in public procurement? And if so, how can we do that? And you also have experience from, you know, OCP in terms of encouraging member states also to make their data open. So the openness is just the starting point. You know, can we have like a standard ranking of countries in terms of integrity in public procurement? So can we define that in integrity, or is it not possible because, as Liz mentioned, that there couldn't be one size fit all? Over to you, Carolis.
Thank you. Is it working? It is. Okay. So the short answer is no, perhaps. And I am with Drago here that the European Commission a few years ago tried to do that. And some people still have access to that index. There is actually integrity index of public procurement. But the methodology behind it and the way it's put together, it's hardly useful, I have to say. So the way of operationalizing that in terms of what needs to be done to improve that score, why would you need to improve that score, is very, very blurry. So we don't really understand that. So the key thing that we are trying to do as Open Contracting Partnership is to help and translate these concepts of integrity into the context and help countries get the right data, infrastructure, to operationalize it. So I can be very specific here. So very recently, we launched a tool called Cardinal, together with Microsoft, a very ambitious attempt, but with a very strong vision as well. So we have 75 indicators on integrity. So we looked at the global scene. We picked the indicators that we see are kind of repeating from country to country. We try to understand, well, how do we put them together in terms of calculation methodology and what kind of data you need to have to be able to actually run them. Now, what we see the challenge is that doing that in one country is very resource intensive. Doing that in two countries is double the work, and do the math if you continue that road. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to help countries automatize that process. So put simply, you want to calculate, let's say, 20 indicators. Give us your data set. We'll give you exactly the insights into what data quality issues, what data structure issues, what data standard issues you have to be able to calculate those risks. Right? And then you can run them in your country. So we hope that that's going to help governments to, first of all, set the foundations right. Because I'm with Liz here that when it comes to actually running the measurement on a continuous basis, the data question is the foundational question. We can intellectualize all we want about indicators and what we mean by one term or another one, but if we have no data, if we don't have good data on consistent basis, that's not going to be helpful. Now, that's challenge number one. Now, challenge number two is institutionalization. So what we do is, well, we say we are a nonprofit. We are in the business of impact, right? So we have to demonstrate impact and not profit. And we help our partners in governments to actually operationalize those indicators. What I mean by that is, for example, when you have a reform, you have to set KPIs. KPI sounds very simple, But when done right in a participatory design, it does actually do a lot of good for some of the reforms. The example could be actually here from local reform in Lithuania, where they set the indicators for themselves, the measurement indicators, and most importantly, put them out in the public. All of a sudden, you have a positive competition going on, and we've seen tremendous results. And I'm happy to tell you more about that reform. And another good example, and I'll stop here, is the Italian anti-corruption agency that is actually trying to push the charge on red flagging. So not only they have a very sophisticated red flagging methodology, which goes beyond metrics like single sourcing, short terms of, bid and proposal and things like that, but it also has contextual indicators. So, the levels of crime, the levels of education, the socioeconomics indexes, and most importantly, what they do is they have an obligation, a legal obligation in law. Every single authority, when preparing a biannual plan of anti-corruption, has to tell and clearly articulate how they use those red flags to inform their anti-corruption strategy decisions. They are in the first years of piloting the approach, so we're very curious to see how it goes. But at least we see the first sort of, birds in showing how do you integrate these data-driven red flagging methodologies of measurement into an institutional machinery. So we are very curious how's that going to work.
Well, thank you, Carolis. I think, you highlighted three really good points: the operationalization, institutionalization, and openness in terms of data. So I'm saving TI and also OECD for last because they have interesting things to say, and we all talk about CPI all the time. But let me ask you, Tom, a pretty straightforward question. Can we meaningfully measure financial integrity and illicit financial flows at the country level? And is there a way also to rank countries in terms of their amount of, illicit financial flows, or in terms of integrity in their finances? It's just about methodology, and again it goes back to what we also mentioned earlier. Can we have a one-size-fits-all type of thing? Although we also have methodology to measure illicit financial flows for SDG indicator 16.5.1. It goes by sectors rather than by typology. Over to you.
Thank you, Anga. I think of all the reports that we've done since our launch in 2006 is a report that we do most years that looks at trade-related illicit financial flows. So of course there are grand corruption illicit financial flows, there are tax evading illicit financial flows. Our sort of signature report looks at trade-related illicit financial flows. And our first report of that type was in 2008. We had hired a former IMF economist who put the methodology together. We used IMF direction of trade statistics and essentially did a mirror analysis where we would look at all trade, imports and exports from each country and compared it to what their partner country reported as far as imports and exports from that country. So it was very labor intensive, but it was the first of its type. From what we knew at the time, there had been country studies, single countries or sub-regional attempts to do this. This was the first attempt that we're aware of that did it on a global scale. It was very well received, the first one. It was not formally peer-reviewed, but as you probably know, economists like to critique other economists' work. And we got a lot of positive feedback, actually. They thought it was an excellent effort, but said, you should also account for missing data, noise in the data. You should account for insurance costs of international trade. You should account for distance of trade between particular trading countries. And over time, we were able to address all those particular concerns, suggestions. And then we also, in around 2016, I think it was, we switched data sets from the IMF Direction of Trade Statistics to the UN Comtrade data set, which was seen as more accurate than the IMF data set. And we have continued to tweak over time and improve it as much as we can, to the point where 2 years ago, I think it is now, UNCTAD did a paper on illicit financial flows due to trade and looked at, I think, 3 different methodologies for trying to estimate this, and ours was one of them. And so no methodology to try to put a number on this is perfect. The data is going to be a little funky sometimes. There's going to be keying errors, but that said, all the data we use is official government trade statistics. And so we have come up with a methodology that we think is pretty solid and will not only provide a estimated dollar figure, but also of trade misinvoicing for each particular country, but will also provide that number as a percentage of that country's total trade, which can be seen as a better way to assess a country's level of trade misinvoicing as a percentage of trade. And so you can rank them either way. You can look at percentage of trade. You can look at the dollar figure. It's essentially an estimate of the magnitude of the problem. You're not going to get perfect results, but it is enough information for governments to be able to assess policy and to determine whether their efforts in the customs departments to address trade misinvoicing, corruption in the customs department, and other factors that may lend itself to certain levels of illicit flows in that area.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Actually, we had a joint publication in 2011 on illicit financial flows from least developed countries just before the least developed countries conference in Istanbul. Actually, that really helped, even to shape the agenda, the outcome agenda of that conference as well. So yeah, I mean, during last 2-3 months, and as Liz is very aware, I also talked to almost 60 people, 60 experts on this measurement, and there are clearly 2 camps. One camp is, Tom just, enlightened us that no methodology is perfect. They all have limitations, and it boils down to 2 things. Why are we measuring? And what are we going to do with that data? If it's for advocacy, CPI is a great tool. Has been a great tool, for example, So yeah, also for the issue on trade and, mispricing, transfer pricing, tax evasion, your data has also been very instrumental globally in terms of advocacy too. Now, let me go to ASPER. So I was there during the OECD Integrity Week, and Liz was also there. Most of us were there too, and you launched OECD's public integrity indicators. So how objective they are and reliable they are, what you do to ensure reliability and objectivity, and what's the main purpose of these indicators? To have a conversation around data openness or to influence policy reform in those countries? And my, personal interest, question of personal interest is, how are you measuring integrity in government? Over to you.
Okay, I think it works now. So to your first question, how reliable are they? 100%, of course. To your second question, what is the aim of them? It's to help countries fight corruption. I forgot your third question.
Hello. How are you influencing the policy reform at the country level with these data?
Okay, that was supposed to be the second round, though.
It's okay. You can go
Okay,
ahead.
but just we can get back to the second one. No, let me move back a little bit there. So I actually reflected whilst we were talking a little bit about the title. I didn't prepare this, but I was a soldier in my past life, and it's not so ambitious. I mean, how to hit a moving target? If you don't know how to hit a moving target, you're an amateur. You don't know what you're doing. So how do you hit a moving target? You practice, and I think that is one of the things that also came out yesterday in the measurement session, is that it's incredible how professionalism has grown in this area, and there's many different methods that have really improved. So I do think we can hit moving targets. I just think that this landscape has become a little bit more complex in terms of having more instruments that you can use for different purposes. That makes it difficult to navigate because there are many good sources out there. There are also a few bad ones. So I would always say, know your sources for what instrument you use. That's probably kind of back to basics, but still, it's a good thing to say. So yes, we focus more on measuring levels of public integrity and corruption risks than measuring direct corruption levels. It all started in 2017 with the adoption of the Council recommendation on public integrity. It took us 2 years to develop these indicators. It was a very iterative process, participatory process with the OECD member countries. And it was really of course, to get buy-in, because indicators need impact, and to have impact, you need buy-in from the countries, but also to field test them with the countries, but also to pick the best KPIs, pick the best key performance indicators that we could leverage as the OECD, because that is, I think, our strength, is to take administrative data from the member countries, standardize that, and kind of slowly harmonize it so that we get comparable rates across at least the OECD membership. So to give you a few examples, some quite basic, because I'm a big believer in the KISS principle, but still I think very effective. So I don't like the word compliance, because it's in the measurement area, what does it mean? I think some of the rates that we're measuring is like simple things like submission rates of interest declarations, where we look at ministers, MPs, judges, top-level civil servants. And it sounds very basic, but again, the results we got is that this differs a lot across countries. It should be 100%, but it's not. And if you have a rate where it's not 100%, it's actionable. And this is something you can do something about as a government. If you don't have the data, as we said, well, you need it. You definitely need that data, because if you don't know what your submission rate of interest declarations is, then you don't know how to fight corruption. So this thing about spreading KPIs was very important for us. So we took inspiration from some of the best things that, in my view, the OECD does, which is, for example, the PISA, if you know the PISA indicators, the product market regulation indicators. So in order not to do an overlap, so to complement, but not to overlap with some good instruments that were already there. So, for example, we're not competing with the Corruption Perception Index, right? We're actually going to Berlin next week, not next week, in 3 weeks, in July, to see how these things can kind of complement each other, which is, I think, very useful. I think there are two types of, let's say, perception surveys. There's perceptions of experts and risk rating agencies. There's perceptions of the population or businesses. I'm a big fan of the last. And I think the CPI is the best index that you have for the overall, let's say, indication of corruption levels that is out there. But that's not what we do. We have perception-based data in our index, sometimes coming from OECD sources like the Trust Survey, but it's not our core aim. What we're definitely not is a kind of mashup index of secondary data sources. So all the data we have is primary data sources from the governments themselves, validated by the governments. And we're also not a peer review mechanism. We don't create, let's say, long narrative reports with recommendations for monitoring a legal instrument. So again, here I think it's quite complementary. So I mentioned the focus on primary data. I want to make a point out of the maybe a bit complex to describe in 1 minute, but that the indicators are designed to cover the full results chain. So we talked about going beyond compliance. In my world, it's about the result chain. So moving from looking at the legislation to institutional practices to some outcomes that actually matters in real life. So the indicators are designed to try and do that. And our Integrity and Anti-Corruption Outlook, which was published in GASIF, you can see some examples in the Outlook where we try to weave together some of these indicators. So is there a legal obligation to disclose interest declarations? Yes, okay. Do you actually submit it in practice? So that's the practice-oriented indicator. Do you have a verification mechanism as an institution to verify these interest declarations? And when you get these different data points, then you start to get a good idea of how it is. But then maybe at the impact level, we also have some good perception surveys, which is about trust in politicians, trust in government. It's not just interest declarations that will determine that, but that should be the end goal. Not submitting the interest declaration, but increasing trust in this case, Parliament. So also when we designed the indicators, it was very important, as you said, that they were not sticky, meaning that they actually are sensitive to changes over time. So every single indicator is composed either of a numerical rate, which is raw data, or a classic checklist of criteria, which is around the quality of a regulation, the quality of an institutional setup. And all of these are published, and you know exactly what you need to improve as a government. And I think that's very important. It's both about the transparency of the methodology itself, but more importantly, that you can actually improve, that it's not because, and I've been there, I've been one of the expert reviewers for various indices. It's not about what I believe about a particular country, but it's whether something very concrete. Do you have a list of incompatibilities for public functions in your regulations, yes or no? And if you don't, then you know what to improve. So, okay. On the data collection side, maybe just to quickly go through what we have and what we don't have. So right now, we're covering areas of strategy, political finance, lobbying, conflict of interest. We just moved in and a bit on open government, but it's more about proactive disclosure of information. We covered corruption risk management, internal control, internal audit, and the next we're going into is judicial integrity, external oversight. So we're not trying to cover every single thing, because if you try to do everything for all countries in the world, you will end up taking too many shortcuts. So we're trying to find, what we're good at, do that well, and then expand gradually as we move along. So we're also expanding in terms of countries covered. So the first 5 years was from the OECD membership to try and design the indicators according to the OECD standards, get feedback from the members. And now we've actually extended invitations to 30 non-members. Of course, first there's a current accession process to the OECD, so the accession members are in the first row, key partners, but also gradually to expand the coverage, because that's very, very useful for comparability, obviously. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Asper. I realized two things. One, violating the rule. I already asked you the second question. So it's okay, we can engage more participants from audience. And the second thing I realize is that we need to talk louder, because we have to compete with the next door presentation. But it's good to see the full room here. So I will ask one question to Roberto, then we'll try to open the floor. Roberto, interestingly, we have this love and hate relationship with CPI index or indices. If there is a little improvement, like one place, two place in one country, you will appear in prime minister's or president's website. Oh, we improved CPI by 2 points during last 2 years. Then, if their ranking goes by 1 or 2 points, they say, oh, this TI methodology is very bad. It's about perception. We don't even know what data they use. So this is exactly the question to you. Can you enlighten all of us what exactly the data you use, what methodology it is, and then also related to that, I'm always a great fan of your barometer survey, by the way. So compared to barometer survey, how different the CPI methodology is. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'd like to start by maybe placing the CPI in this whole debate that we've been having today. And I think it's important to remember that the CPI was one of the first metrics of corruption that came up, right? And I mean, hearing Liz talk, for example, about where we want to go, the issues of reliability and so on, I think those are very important goals. The problem is, as we heard, I think also from other panelists, the data is not necessarily always there. And I think there's a bit, I think, of a false dichotomy there between perceptions means they're not reliable, like this index is not reliable, versus we need absolutely objective data measured by the statistical agency, and that is the ultimate expression of objectivity. I think that data can also be manipulated, and we have seen that as well in the Global South. So I think trying to make absolute objectivity in the measurement of corruption our North Star is a bit of a misguided goal, because I think there'll always be a level of measurement error. Exactly. We can get to 99% precisely, right? And I think the reason why we have this love-hate relationship with the CPI is precisely this lack of data. So particularly, again, if you look at the Global South, you'll see that a lot of data is just missing, and then the CPI just fills in that gap, and then just becomes this way of saying, well, as you were saying, if it goes up, it's doing amazing, we're doing great, look at us, at all what we did. If it doesn't go up or stays the same, then we criticize TI for not having included this or that information there, but like, look at these laws that we passed. We know now, for example, that number of laws does not necessarily equate better anti-corruption results, right? So I think this is a very nuanced conversation that needs to be had, and which also speaks to, I think, Jasper's point, is not that we are looking, at least TI, for a measurement of corruption that will, replace them all. Because I think that's not going to happen. I think, in other, if you think of other sciences like economics or even medicine, right? You have different tools, you have different tests, you have different sort of, you have a different toolkit to do different things, right? So the CPI, I like to think of it as your yearly checkup, right? Where you go to the doctor, they take your temperature, they check your weight, your blood pressure, and then they tell you there's something off. We're going to need to run more tests. The problem is we're missing those tests. I mean, we're now developing them, like several organizations are working on that, but the reality is we are not there. And even measuring very simple things, and I like to use the example of bribery, right? Just measuring bribery, which is our is this objective measurement of a specific type of corruption that is embedded in the SDG framework. All of the data that UN report, not all of it, but like 2/3 of the data that the UN reports officially for that goal is actually collected by TI through the Global Corruption Barometer. So governments have been given the chance to compile this information, and they haven't. So it's been it's been TI's effort, the one that is still sort of documenting that. And as Liz mentioned, I think at the beginning as well, it's an incredibly expensive effort. Not necessarily. I mean, it requires, I think, a big coalition. TI loves doing the barometer as well. But unfortunately, it's not easy to fund. I think the last round of barometers cost around 5 million euros, which is difficult to fundraise for. And the idea is, well, if statistical offices at the national level can report this officially to the UN, then problem solved. We don't need to run the barometer anymore, right? But that hasn't been the case. So we don't really have anybody reporting on this. And I think that also speaks a little bit about the political will of certain governments to actually measure this thing. Many, I think, have preferred, I mean, if I want to be cynical about it, have preferred to stick to the CPI, because then there's plausible deniability. If you go up or down, if it goes up, you can attribute it to whatever you want. If it goes down, you can just blame TI for being terrible at its job, right? So I think, yeah, that's, I think, a bit of our love-hate relationship with the CPI. And in terms of the barometer, I think it's not only about the experiences of corruption, which we collect. I think what is also very valuable, particularly if we want to live in a democratic society where we take into account what our citizens are saying, the perceptions of people also matter, because that also shapes the way in which people behave on a daily basis, and also reflects that sometimes no matter what the government does, maybe people are not perceiving it as progress, right? So if we really value and we want to live in a democratic society, I think it's also important to still listen to what people have to say. And unfortunately, over the past few years, I think the result, I think, of trying to move towards this more objective measurement of corruption has also meant that we sort of leave behind these other metrics of, how are the people feeling, what do they think about anti-corruption, how do they assess what we're doing, and so on. So I think we need to use all the tools that we have at our disposal, because I think everyone here in this panel has the ultimate goal of really fighting corruption and ending this. And we really need all the tools at our disposal. So I don't think it's about, again, replacing the CPI or moving away from asking people or the attitudes. I think, that's why Jesper is also coming to Berlin, as he was saying, in July, because we want to explore additional ways of, complementing our data and seeing how we can come to other conclusions. We've also documented, I also want to maybe finish by saying that TI doesn't only measure corruption through the CPI and the GCB. Those might be the most visible tools, right? But there's a lot of efforts that have been done not just by TI Secretariat in Berlin, but also by many, many chapters to document corruption in public procurement, to document undue influence, for example, in campaign finance. And just because many of these tools are developed at a national level, because as Liz was saying, we don't need, not every tool needs to be global, not everything needs to measure everything. We have different legal frameworks, so the risks will vary from one country to another as well. So we also have chapters who have developed individualized tools or tools for their particular context. The problem is sometimes these are not very attractive to publish broadly or publicize broadly, right? But it doesn't mean that we have not made a lot of progress in this space. And I would like to perhaps also point at efforts that were done. I mean, Jesper and Liz were also there, I think last year or 2 years ago when we were discussing this UNODC framework for the measurement of corruption, which I think also puts forward this idea that the best way to measure corruption is through, I guess, triangulation, right? Because as I was saying, since you will always have some measurement error, I think it's important to also see what do these different tools tell us, and how do we interpret this, right? So those were just my reflections. I hope I did answer the question in the end.
Yes, you did, Roberto. Right. Actually, what you said, I think we all agree in this panel that we need to use all the tools at our disposal. Of course, I mean, measuring corruption has been the moving target. Now we have new forms of corruption, for example. How do you measure beneficial ownership transparency, business integrity, now integrity of technology, for example, and then the whole shipping industry we were talking about yesterday, Tom and ourselves, and Cecilia is also there. So by the way, earlier when Asper was mentioning about the KISS principle, I'm sure you all are familiar with it. It's just like keep it simple, stupid. So, but what I liked about OECD indicators is primarily the administrative data collected from the government themselves, and also to harmonize them together with the government. So that's an interesting aspect. And more than that, you are also working with 16, 17 non-OECD countries. So if we include OECD plus non-OECD countries, you will have a relatively sizable data set. We are excited to partner with you. So I think at this point we have 39, 40 minutes. So let's open the floor. And we would really like to hear from the audience. Please raise your hand and identify yourself. Don't comment like 10, 15 minutes. 1 minute comment, 1 minute question. Okay, who is moving microphone? Yeah. I think we have 2 hands here. And I encourage female members of our audience to participate, because if Liz was not here, it was fully male. Yes.
My name is Yamaturabi, and I work for UNDP. My question is, we've had a lot of sessions nowadays about the use of AI. Is this changing the way that we are measuring corruption and future, and what is the thinking about it?
Yes, my name is Ken. I come from the Fight Against Facilitation Payments Initiative, and we love data. Actually, we have set out to collect data to make a difference and make an influence in the world. So what we have found is that we are missing taxonomy. Taxonomy that we can use to enrich our data so that we can compare and we can use it for different purposes. Now we have a panel of experts here, data experts. What is your advice to us on how to get that taxonomy? Because we can just ask ChatGPT to invent the taxonomy for us. It's very easy, but I'm not sure that we can, use that going forward. So, what is your advice to us?
Hi, I'm Olga Peskunova, Center of Policy and Legal Reforms. And I have the next question. If we look at CPI, we notice that, for example, Belarus has much more rank than Ukraine. And I definitely know why. But it means also that the CPI is not ideal scale for measuring corruption. And my question is, how do you think if we start to, for example, measure integrity and transparency, would it mean that these both scales will correlate it? And for example, if some country has a high level of integrity, it also has a low level of corruption.
I'm not sure if I've been hijacked into the conversation due to diversity or knowledge, because I'm not a data expert. But I think when we're looking at data and measurements, are we missing sometimes to just ask, why are we bringing this data to the table? What do we want to achieve with this data? I think that we have come from a development where data used to be maybe limited, and it still is in some areas, but in some areas we sit with all this data and not really using it. So I think the question is also for the data experts, do we have enough data now, or are we asking ourselves really, really hard, how are we going to use this data to drive impact?
Hi, yeah, my name is Camila Ugas. I'm a criminal attorney from Peru, and I also am a researcher at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. I'm also not a data expert whatsoever, but I wonder, I believe when we were talking about the OECD data collection, you mentioned that your primary sources are the data provided by the governments themselves. I wonder how are you making sure that this data is accurate and that it's not being corrupted by the governments themselves? Because I believe that's that's very highly likely in super corrupt countries. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have enough set of questions. So, use of AI, is it changing the, the nature of corruption measurement or not? Then the question about taxonomy, the facilitation payment and so on. Should we ask ChatGPT or should we ask Liz? And then the question on CPI, Belarus versus Ukraine, so Roberto. And then there was also the question on OECD data collection. Are they corrupted already by the corrupt countries? What can we do? And also, Cecily has interesting question. Whether the question is about, do we still need more data, or the question is about how do we use the existing data for policy reform or to influence policies on the ground. So let's do this. Let's start from this side, one by one. Whatever you feel responding, please do it.
I can do it all. AI, maybe an example, right? We come back to the same point. You got to get the foundations right, which is data. To be able to employ AI, you need good data plus training plus time. I'll give you an example. In the field of public procurement, European Union has a concept of high-value datasets and the Open Data Directive. What does that mean? That the European Commission includes a certain data set, for example, company ownership to some extent, public procurement in the future, geospatial data, and then they provide guidance on how to collect that data, and the rules are that you have to provide it as open data through an API. Now, that we see as a huge opportunity for procurement, because that's where the source of guidance, harmonization, and standardization can come from, right? That's where you have a potential for 27 countries get their structure of procurement data harmonized. And that's where we can raise all these questions about data quality, data structure, and I will come back to our cardinal tool that actually does that. So it helps check the quality, check the structure, and things like that. So that's the way forward. It has to go through harmonization. If you want to apply the new technology on a large-scale data sets, there is no other way. And we have to find appropriate structures for that to happen. Now, in terms of, well, do we have enough data? I'm sure that there will be more answers to that question. But from my perspective, look, CPI, for example, it's still standing. It's going to stand. I'm with everybody that it should be a great place to start, but it's not a good place to stop. Right? The reality of the matter is that we have so much good data already, and we are asking more nuanced questions about structure quality standards to be able to apply new technology, right? So that's not the worst place to be. We do actually have that data. So our focus, while thinking about more data coming out, our focus should be really on getting those foundations and structures right to fill those data pipes so that we can start applying AI. In the field of procurement, I can confidently tell you, we are nowhere near in the place of applying AI on the EU level, although about half of the countries already applying AI for their procurement procedures, but really on the simple things like, for example, checking CPV code, checking the empty values, helping you with specifications, filling the empty fields, things like that. It's helpful, but it's not the potential. The potential is way out there, and we really have to move to that direction. And one more thing I will say is that, in terms of, just maybe through an anecdote, I'm not going to say which country that is, but because that might be embarrassing, but we support governments through their reforms. So I'm currently working with one of the EU governments, one of the best governments in the whole of EU, a champion in many, many fields. And they approached us and they said, well, could you do a ranking of transparency of public procurement across the EU, and could you rank us in that ranking so that we know where we do well, where we do bad? Now, that sounds good. In the implementation of it, we started feeling, the ill motivations. So the motivation was to really go through the fields that they know they have, include that in the methodology, and manipulate that so that they're on top. So the goal all of a sudden is to show that that country is actually doing well and justify their policies previously, so they don't really have a lot to step up, right? That's not really driving change. And the point I'm trying to land on is that as a user of all the measurement tools, we at OCP, the way we look at the feasibility of indicators is the only angle really, the actionable, is there an action that you can take based on certain measurements? So when the public anti-corruption authority includes CPI as their metrics, I remember having those conversations. So what does that mean in terms of taking actions to actually boost CPI? That's a difficult conversation to have. And then that's why I spoke in the beginning about translation from indicators. We now have capacity and enough data to really have data-driven analytics on an institutional level or a national level to drive that change. But I agree, we should look at it holistically as a system. The international level, good place to start. We are already in the good place to start on a national level. We gotta push institutions to really embed metrics and measurements in everything they do. And that's the whole sort of holistic system we're looking at.
Yeah, well, the AI has the feature which is basically, I think, the most useful one for what we are doing, the measuring, which is, it's helping us to increase the predictability of the event. No, we are not measuring just because we would like to do the measurement, but we would like to predict things. And let's say I participated similar event 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong. Basically, we spent a lot of time on discussing how the AI can help us. And exactly in this area, there are the most positive features, let's say, of AI mentioned, that we really can get in the position that we'll be able to predict things. But under the condition, and this has been said several times now, that we base this predictability on the qualitative data. If you don't feed the proper data, nothing will help us. And there's plenty of data out already on, especially in this area of corruption. We'll just have to make, let's say, the specialists in this area will have to do it in the way that we will be able to absolutely rely on the data which is collected. And I have to say that, let's say, through the monitorings, monitoring is quite a subjective exercise. And bringing subjectivity into collection of data and analysis of data, it will never end good. So this, we will have to put a lot of emphasis here. And last but not least, because I'm not a specialist for the, let's say, the data, so mentioning CPI, I met many countries which are extremely, let's say, disappointed, I could use some other words too, when it comes to how the CPI shows the level of corruption in their countries. But we always, when we analyze the situation, we always get to go to the conclusion that it's nothing wrong, well, nothing particularly wrong with the methodology, but simply the methodology was not applied properly by the national chapters in the countries. So they had the same set of methodology in all countries around the world. It was just not applied in a proper way, and as they would have to apply them. So that was the problem, but I think, let's say, there are so many other indices out today that even if there's let's call it a failure when it comes to one country, it's easy to look for some other results, and you will easily put the country where it belongs to.
As far as accuracy of government data, we use, as I said, we use government data to look at illicit flows from trade transactions, misinvoicing. As part of our filtering process, we will eliminate a country that records an import, but there's no corresponding export from their partner country, so-called orphan trades. And we'll also do the opposite. Any country that reports a particular export of a product to country X, and country X has no record of the import, we eliminate that from our so-called ghost transactions. Through that filtering process, we actually eliminate a third of the trade data that the UN Comtrade data set provides. That's as accurate as we can possibly get. Now, for the data we do use, can we say it's precise? No, you can't say it's precise. Could governments tweak it for one reason or another? Possibly. We haven't come up with a good idea on how we can accurately figure that out. If anybody in the room has ideas on how we might be able to do that, we're all ears. We're always trying to be as precise as we possibly can. As far as the question about whether we have enough data, no. And I'll tell you what we would like to see. In the mid-teens, around 2015 or so, I want to say it was Ecuador, don't quote me on it, I'm pretty sure it was Ecuador, provided on their Customs Department website Excel sheets of all imports and exports in and out of the country. The only thing they didn't have was the company name. So we got date, value, HS code, you name it. There was probably 20 columns of data that was provided. A year or so later, they took it down. But what that provides us is an opportunity to dive into transaction level data, and we can find red flags. We can find patterns of misinvoicing. It is extremely unlikely for any international trade to end with no sense, just a whole number. When you see that, high possibility that that's a red flag for some sort of manipulation of the value of the goods. We can also pick out of that anomalies, either extremely high or extremely low prices for similar products or for the same product. We use HS codes as far as our analysis goes. If we were to get a global norm where customs departments universally provide this type of data on their websites, it would essentially revolutionize the way we're able to assess trade misinvoicing, trade-based money laundering, and those types of illegal activities. It's far in the future, if at all, but that's the type of data we would like to see.
So on AI, I won't say much about this because my fellow panelists have already given some good answers, but a couple of things I would say is I've seen it being used in really interesting ways, particularly by supreme audit institutions, and where it's used to look at very big data sets of things like complaints, and to be able to filter them to work out what the priority is for where you allocate your very scarce human capital to go and look at those and investigate them. So Brazil, for example, uses AI in this way. And I think that's a really sensible way of using it. At the same time, there are, of course, always risks of discrimination and bias that we've already got in our data that we then end up reinforcing if we're not careful using AI. So it does have to be done carefully, I think. On facilitation payments and the need for a taxonomy, I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it at the moment, but probably what I would start with is look for some data sets, essentially, a body of cases of facilitation payment requests or payments. I'm not sure exactly where you'd find that, but you might, from MACN, perhaps get some reports about this happening in the maritime industry. There might be other private sector organizations that are collecting these reports, or potentially whistleblowing hotlines. So I would probably trawl through those and think about categorizing them as a starting point. The other question then, of course, is how you categorize them. So you probably want to sort of do it, seeing what you're finding in the data. You might look at it in terms of government function. You might think about the definition of facilitation payment and think about what kinds of routine services there are, and what exact advantage you're getting, whether it's around speed or it's around some other kind of discretionary power. So I think you'd probably want to do that in a quite iterative way, see what you get from the data, go back and test it with some people who are exposed to facilitation payment risk, and then think about expanding it. But it's a great question. On the relationship between transparency and integrity, so the sort of second part of the question about the CPI, there is a broad assumption that more transparency will mean less corruption and more integrity. We're sitting here at a 21st conference organized by an association which is built on that assumption. So I think, broadly speaking, we think there's good reason to think there's a relationship. Having said that, some of the research on this is actually quite mixed. And I think really what it tells us is that transparency is probably a necessary condition or a good starting point, but you need transparency plus. So you need to also make sure that that leads to accountability and that there's someone listening on the government side who's then going to act and change things in response to what transparency uncovers. I would also say that because of our assumption about transparency, we tend to also assume that digitalization of government and e-government is good. That then factors in sometimes to measurement, that we just think that if we see a lot of digitalization, then we're not going to have much corruption. And again, it's not that simple, I think. And there's a bit of a risk there that we end up thinking that countries which have maybe got good systems but can't afford to digitalize everything are just sort of lower resource environments, that they're, maybe they're not so good at anti-corruption, but they might be. It's expensive and difficult and complicated to do digitalization. And then finally on the, do we have enough data? No. I won't surprise you by being the academic who says we always need more data and evidence. But I think actually one reason is that it's an iterative process. So when we get more data, we see that we can develop new methods and detect new problems, or get more evidence essentially using that data. And then once we've done that, we realize, oh, if we had this extra bit of data, we could do this as well. And so then that creates a new demand for data. So I think partly it's just inherent in it is that we will always need more data because we get cleverer and we get more evidence, but then we have more questions.
Yeah, I won't get into the data question anymore because I think everybody has talked about it. But I think the only, my only addition would be, what would be really helpful as we get more data, or we advocate for more data, would also be to prioritize the data that we want to be made available. So I think that would be, so yes to more data, but also to prioritization perhaps. On the CPI question, I just checked the rankings because surprisingly I don't know them by heart. I try to forget them the day after the launch. So no, I saw that Belarus and Ukraine are indeed quite close. I think there is 1 point difference between one and the other. I think when you have, such a tool that is trying to capture so many different types of corruption into one number. Of course, there's measurement error. I wouldn't say, there's a huge difference between the two. But then comes, I think, what this whole panel has been discussing, which is how do we look under the hood of those numbers, right? And I think the point that Liz raised about transparency is a very important one. So not always more transparency leads to less corruption. And I think the other assumption that has been challenged recently is also that more democracy automatically translates into better anti-corruption outcomes. I think that was a bit of a naive assumption to start with. I think is something that we want to believe in. But I think what we have learned in the past few years as well is that there are autocracies and authoritarian regimes that control corruption through means that I would not necessarily recommend, but through high levels of repression, maybe policing everyone. And what you do see is at least certain types of corruption, like perhaps petty bribery or administrative corruption, might decline. But usually what you get in those areas as well is, you have absolutely no clue what happens behind closed doors in government. So I think when you look at Belarus and Ukraine, it will be important to look at more nuanced metrics of corruption and look for, what is the what is driving what. So I would assume that Ukraine is still struggling a little bit more with bribery than Belarus is. But of course, we've seen also how some of the repressive, Belarus also enacted several anti-corruption reforms that were relatively successful, but then after the protests and the election, many of those were dismantled as well. And I think something that is admirable about Ukraine is that despite the war, a lot of the anti-corruption framework that they had in place has, of course, there's not as much access to data and so on, but I think the government has really tried to make a case for, not everything is going to go out the window, which is obviously a very different approach to the one in Belarus, right? So I think that's also why it makes a difference to be a democracy or a dictatorship when you try to fight corruption. I do think that the democratic way is a more sustainable one because you need to embed, so fighting corruption is not only about anti-corruption reforms. There are many other issues that matter, including, having proper checks and balances that can, hold government accountable or the executive accountable, having civil society. I think that really a free press. I think all of this are additional checks and balances on government to prevent corruption. And I think, of course, on that front, Ukraine does much better than Belarus, right? But Ukraine still faces several challenges that Belarus solved through horrible repression. So again, you just need to look at the composition of corruption under the hood. And on AI, just quickly as well, I have also seen some creative uses of AI. The latest one I saw last week, for example, was how the Netherlands used AI, or some banks in the Netherlands used AI, for example, to flag suspicious transactions reports. And what they saw was that the algorithm also predicted quite well when compared, so when fed the data from what people flagged to what the AI flagged, it was actually quite good. So I think the algorithm didn't make that many mistakes, didn't flag too many false negatives or positives, etc., etc., etc. The problem was, once flagged, you have absolutely no clue why the algorithm flagged this. And that's then what the banks were complaining about, right? So when you have a bank teller telling, okay, this doesn't seem right, you know at least why it was flagged. But AI didn't. Another use I think that I've seen is to try and measure environmental crime and degradation and then link that, for example, to perhaps licenses, contracts, or concessions that were illegally granted, for example, or that are not in the registry, for example. So that's another nice case of using technology, not only AI, but also satellite imaging and so on, to monitor these things. And yeah, I think that's it from my side.
Thank you. I'll warm up to my question by just some random thoughts on the first ones. So on AI, it's a very good question. Maybe I'll mix it to the other question on do we have enough data. So I mean, we have other colleagues at the OECD that does basically this work, so I'm borrowing from them. But I mean, I think yesterday in the measurement session you had Alina Munch, PPD, that said it was maybe a bit negative. So it's not my words, it's hers. But she said sometimes there is corruption measurement for sport. It means like for fun, or like it's not so serious. And it relates to the data that we do have some areas, some islands of excellence where we have so data that we can use AI tools to do some super things like predictions and red flags, etc. I think most data scientists, when they look at even at those data sets, they would find that there's a lot of bias in them, and you don't want to rely on the results. But it's a helpful and interesting for sports exercise. But I think for 98% of what we do, the data is not there, and it's really rudimentary type of work that we do. But to give you an example, I mean, we do, for example, we have one indicator on the number of laws adopted through extraordinary procedure in Parliament, where we then download, we access the parliamentary websites, we run an algorithm, so we identify those laws. Either they're coded with extraordinary procedure, or we can see it's within 10 days of adoption. But I still insist that we check manually, spot checks on these laws, because there's various problems with these. It's not uniform data, right? There's a lot of problems with all this, but it's interesting. And in some cases, it helps us. Let's just kind of speed up the analysis, which is very good. And even basic things like translations, etc. It's not AI, but that is actually the most helpful thing for us to go through so much information. So, and then maybe one more point on the, do we have enough data? So yes, in some areas we have. I think the main point is that it's very uneven. So we have some areas like procurement, which is where everyone is fishing because the data sets are quite good there. But then you have measurement error, right? Because everyone wants to fish in that dam and in that particular type of contracts. So these are high-level contracts, not low-level contracts. So you already have a bias there within this little data set. But then you have, but of course, corruption is not just in procurement. So, I mean, we are trying to measure conflict of interest, lobbying. People want me to try and measure state capture. I said, no, it's tough. But, you know, and this here, we don't have a lot of data for all of these things. So I think that is more actually the problem, is that it's again about being a conscious user of this, that it's easy to say, okay, the problem is, when you talk about bribery, the problem is procurement. I remember some reports coming out that the biggest risks are in the procurement field. Actually not. It's just because we have more data in that field. Or we don't know, basically, because we only have data from the procurement field, so we don't know in whether other parts of the value chain, you know, these risks really come up. But I will be boring and agree with the panel. One of the main conclusions of our outlook, the first one was highlighting the implementation gap. So we look at the de jure indicators and the de facto indicators, and we see whether regulations are implemented in practice. That was the first finding. The second finding was that there is a data gap, that for many basic registries, countries don't have them. So, okay, so going to my question on the data accuracy, it's a very good one. First, I never understand why, for me, the main question is, has the data been tampered with, basically, when it's submitted? So it's not really for me, because I think you always get better data accuracy in any social science by allowing the evaluee or the respondent to validate the data, getting the primary data from the evaluee, sending it back for fact checking. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily, you know, corrupted. It just gives them a chance to fact check your data. But then your question is more, what do we do if the data we receive is not accurate? And it's very simple. We check, and every single indicator is checkable. So let's say and it starts with the questionnaire. So we never ask, what is your interest rate submission percentage? We ask for the link to the publicly available register, and we calculate the rate. If that is not publicly available, then we ask for all the interest declarations. And I have a few delegates from the working party in the room who's gone through that. And this is where AI again is overhyped. That incredibly tedious process. Luckily, I have a few interns who love to dig through files of going through every single interest declaration file from every single official in the country and calculate manually the rate. There is no way to yet automatize that. So that we can check, and most of the time we of course ask for public sources, so it's checkable. But I would say I actually don't encounter that. I think most often it's a voluntary exercise. So most often governments would say, I don't want to provide the data, which happens very often. So if I think they would choose that option of not providing the data than to tamper with the data source. We have a few cases where we then say we don't have enough data from you, so we choose not to publish. We choose not to include you in the data set. That is our only, let's say, recourse, particularly for non-member countries. It's a bit different for members because it is tied to the legal instruments, so there is an obligation to provide the data. That's it, yeah. This is a fun fact. You also have to be cautious the other way. Actually, after a year, I started learning that even if countries say, no, we don't have that, some cases you still have to dig, and then they actually do have that. So that is where it's not a small job, and you cannot do it for no funds, basically, because if you want to do it right, you have to not just check the yeses, you have to even check the nos.
Okay, we literally have 3 minutes and 57 seconds. So this is going to be the rapid wrap up. So just finish your answer in 30 seconds. What would be the big thing on corruption measurement in next 5 years? Okay, we start with Carolis.
Thank you. You can't manage what you cannot measure. I think that we have to translate the international efforts into a habit of institutions and countries to measure themselves and work across those measurements, and so that they actually can drive change. That's my key.
Drago?
First of all, it's not a fair question which would be fair because you know that I'm participating in another effort to measure corruption. So I would say the best would be to manage to measure it.
I don't know about in the next 5 years, but transparency of transaction level trade data would be tremendous.
I think it's a kind of let 100 flowers bloom approach. So there's lots and lots of really great stuff that's happening at country level in different anti-corruption agencies, in civil society organizations. So I think actually the next big thing will be letting all of that innovation happen and seeing where it takes us.
I have very low standards. I think given that in 5 years we'll already be at almost 2030, I would really like to at least have the data for SDG 16.5 reported. If you ask me, I would love to have still 2 data points between now and then to be able to at least measure whether we made any progress to achieving that goal that we set almost a decade ago. So that would be my Santa Claus wish list for this year.
Very quick. I'm with Liz. I think it's going to be incremental. I think we're moving quite fast, but it's not going to be a big bang silver bullet thing that's going to happen. My own personal goal is to get 70 countries in the data set.
Well, that was really good response. I'm not going to summarize, this fantastic discussion we had here, but let me just mention that we need to continue building the momentum on measurement, particularly promoting data culture. What I mean by data culture is producing more data. Of course, we need more data, but also standardization of data, and also encouraging the use of data as well. So all these three components. And last year we organized a global conference on measuring corruption, and we issued Vienna principle on measuring corruption, thanks to Liz. Next year we are partnering with OECD, UNODC, IACA, and all of you here to organize the second global conference on measuring corruption. All of these issues will also be discussed there. It's more about building momentum. This time we will also bring TI as a co-organizer too. So you are all welcome to that conference. So we'll announce sometime later this year. So let's give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists. And also ourselves, because we woke up at 7 for network meeting in the morning. It's a long day. Thank you so much.